Welcome to our program of Buddhist study and practice. So, as always, kindly recognize the value of this in terms of addressing the very root of suffering everywhere at all times, and hence generate the motivation in regards to this practice, which is the motivation really to apply this with the ultimate objective of freeing all sentient beings. So this is what we call preparing with bodhicitta. And that actually is something we apply both at the time of study, but also at the time of meditation. And it makes for a vast difference in terms of the project that we're undertaking, not just limited to a particular personal practice, but also something that really has a far greater value, in which we see ourselves really as part of a larger community of sentient beings, and not just standing powerlessly and watching the troubles of the world, but understanding where the troubles of the world originate and knowing what needs to be done to alleviate these. So in that sense, then, the spirit of our undertaking is far greater. And this applies both when we're studying and also when we're practicing meditation. And then we would say, so having prepared with bodhicitta, we would say the main practice is without reference point, which means then that we just simply undertake whatever we're doing in terms of study or practice without second thoughts, without distraction. And then at the end, we dedicate. And that's again where we come back to the issue of merit, because what we're doing really is we're engaging in activities that connect us with enlightenment. And this is not just activities that are, you could say, good from the point of view of creating circumstances for a happy or prosperous condition of well-being in the future, but it's more than that. It's actually generating this mind that's set on the project of enlightenment. And that's what we mean with merit then. Essentially, the circumstances that are there in order to bring us further on the path of enlightenment. And so when we complete any practice of meditation or study, we dedicate this to the practice of enlightenment, to the attainment of enlightenment. We dedicate to the well-being, the temporary well-being of all sentient beings, and their ultimate establishment and freedom. And that's also why we, at the end of the session of practice, we chant something like the aspiration prayer of Maitreya, to really sort of, you could say, give our merit a particular direction. So then, in terms of the foundations for our practice, everything that we're doing on the Buddhist path really just has one objective, and that is to eliminate our confusion. It's to eliminate the cognitive delusional condition that fixates on what in fact has no reality. So this cultivation is called the cultivation of prajna, and we do this at all times in terms of whether we're studying, whether we're reflecting on the teaching, and whether we're practicing. Whatever we're doing, it all amounts to antidotes to this confused conditions, and it all really adds to this capacity that cuts through deception, cuts through delusion. So when we talk about wisdom, we are not just talking about accumulating a lot of information, but it's really about the discerning that begins to see through the delusion that keeps us and all sentient life in the condition of suffering. So presently we're looking at then this very profound text from Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso called The Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. And that is exactly what this text is about. It's exactly about us beginning to see through the assumptions that hold us prisoner in samsara. So we've looked at the basic view of dependent arising and how dependent arising essentially spells out selflessness. Now we're looking at how the foundations for what constitutes the foundations of dependent arising, namely all the various elements that we can see. Once something is put together of various elements. It doesn't have an individual inherent existence. But we might say, well, okay, I'm made up of many moments of consciousness, or the world out there is made out of many different particles. But there's still something real there. And in that way, we haven't really gone all the way. You could say we haven't really been radical enough in terms of our analysis, and we're still clinging on to some notion of solidity. And this constitutes what we would call a cognitive obscuration. It's where we still sustain duality. There's still a sense of I and something there, whether it's consciousness or whether it's matter. And that's where the Chittamatra school of the Mahayana and the Mahayana in general, they begin to understand this whole construction of solidity entirely originates on the basis of our mind. So we understand there's not really a solid world, there's not really a solid consciousness, there's simply just the mind and its projections. And that's where last time then Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso gave us the example of the dream, that of course in the dream everything seems very real and so forth, but in fact it's all taking place within the mind. And similarly also, yes, this is exactly what happens to us. We also perceive everything in terms of just perceptions of the mind. We're labeling everything in a particular way. So we can see this from the point of view of how others see the same thing differently from us, and also just from the mere fact that everything that we're experiencing is really just goes through consciousness. It's consciousness that generates this particular perception. So that's where we would say, and the Chittamatran view then really is, everything arises within our consciousness and dissolves back into consciousness. There is no actual reality out there. So this is a very interesting proposition, and it's important that we don't then fall into the idea then, well, there's nothing there except just me dreaming up everything, and that's what we call solipsism. And that's of course where the Khenpo, and this is again so good with his Khenpo, he's actually sat down with his students and had discussion and dialogue so that he knows where the Western, you could say, the belief systems, they're stuck. This is very rare that Tibetan lamas do this, actually sit down and really understand the, you could say, the foundational belief systems of the audience, which is very different from that in Tibet and India, needless to say. And Khenpo is then aware of this condition of solipsism, where people actually might say, well, everything is the mind, then there's nothing except just me in this world. So anyway, this is not what the Chittamatra in any way are saying, but they're just saying that everything, the way that we paint, the way that we construct the world is on the basis of this mind. And that's something that we can verify, of course, in terms of our own experience. And he then gave the dream example. So now he's looking at, and very much taking into account that, you know, he might give this example, but hopefully, this is so important, the audience might object. There's nothing worse than an audience that just sits and goes, okay, the man said that. And sort of like, all right, or am I supposed to believe this? Now, as a card-carrying Buddhist, now I've heard Buddhist doctrine, am I supposed to then believe this? And that's exactly what the Buddha didn't want. He never wanted anybody to just become blind followers of a particular doctrine. The Buddha wanted us to look at reality, but he's proposing some things that we can look at and sort of go, ah, that's right. And that's where the discussion is so important. That's where debate is so important, that there's questioning taking place. Because when there's questioning taking place, when there's doubt taking place, then actually the points begin to be crystallized. And then somebody says, this is what I believe, or this is how my understanding, and what is it you're saying? And then an understanding can begin to generate and to crystallize. And so that's where in the Buddhist tradition, we're not about becoming intellectuals, but it's very important that there's some communication taking place between the teacher and the student. And so objection is very important. That's also, for example, if you read some of the great masters, every time they make a point, they're also taking into account the objections that could come up. So that's, for example, if you read Chogyam Trungpa's writings, you'll always see that he might make a proposition, but then he'll immediately, you could say, preempt the confusion that could arise on the basis of that proposition. So this is where this kind of awareness of the audience's disposition is so important, and in general that there's continually, you could say, a preempting and taking into consideration how the students could understand it, and how maybe this understanding needs to be, you could say, clarified. So here then, of course, when we talk about everything being like a dream, you might say, well, dream is a bit different from my waking experience. And so the Khenpo says, maybe you're still not convinced. One knows one is awake because time is passing in a regular and predictable manner, so that one can synchronize events with an apparently stable and independent world outside world, right? We have the atomic clock, and like Tongse Khenpo says, you know, the relative world seems so, you could say, what makes it seem so real is that it works so well. So then he says, this is only another function of the stable way in which one's experience is unfolding. In fact, subjectively, time seems to be going fast or slow according to one's mood and situation. And this is also something that the French philosopher Henry Bergson, he established also, the understanding that time is so relative, depending, and really only exists as a conception within the subject. So the Khenpo says, as for synchronizing, when events occur together, they are automatically synchronized. And if they do not, one thinks up a reason to explain it. So if one cannot, one calls it a mystery. And then there have been plenty of unsolved mysteries in the history of mankind. So sometimes unexplainable things happen. For example, people have premonitions and these kind of things that seem to defy the ordinary understanding of time and events being progressive. So that's where there are mysterious things, you know, premonitions, clairvoyance, dreams, indications, all these kind of things, right? So that's where even ordinary persons who subscribe to a hard, solid, materialistic reality, they so are up against these kind of phenomena that are just then regarded as things that shouldn't really take place, nevertheless take place, anomalies. So these are then labeled mystery. From a Buddhist point of view, there's not really any mysteries. It's just that reality is not the way that we ordinarily perceive it. So from the point of view of ordinary perception, sure, there are mysterious things, but if we have a greater understanding of what reality, what constitutes reality, what brings about the perception of reality, then these so-called mysteries are not that mysterious altogether. Khenpo then comes with this story. And if any of you have ever seen this, this is my favorite movie by Tongse Khenpo called Travelers and Magicians. Then we have this actually in there, in that movie, this following story actually plays out. So the Khenpo says, there is a story about a man who went to a magician's home and was offered a cup of tea. He took a sip of it. What he did not know was that the magician had put a spell in the tea. So no sooner had he put his cup down, that then he was under the sway of a magical illusion, in which he took his horse and rode to the end of the world, where there was a great ocean, so he could go no further. He met a beautiful woman whom he married, and by whom he had 3 children. He lived with her happily for 3 years until, falling upon bad times, he was driven to despair and threw himself into the ocean. At that point, the effect of the spell wore off, and he found himself back at the magician's house with the tea still in front of him. So little time had passed that the tea had not stopped swirling in the cup after he had put it down. This, incidentally, is this is also found in the Longchen Nyingtik within the writings of Jigme Lingpa, where he gives these various examples similar to this, where we actually meditate like as if this had happened to us. We just think this happened, then this happened, and a whole lifetime goes by. And all of a sudden we come to the end of our life and we've wasted our life, and we sort of just supplicate the 3 jewels and saying, gosh, what have I done? And then all of a sudden we realize we were just here. So in this way, this is a very skillful way really of understanding how phenomena, they have no reality apart from the solidity that we attribute to them, including time. So Khenpo says the point is that the impression of time passing and the apparent synchronicity of events does not prove that anything other than the mind itself is creating it. It is well known, for example, that meditators can go into samadhi for hours or weeks at a time, but it does not seem to them that any time has passed at all. So that happens. And there's this wonderful story I love to tell about Tugurjen Rinpoche, the late Tugurjen Rinpoche, his uncle, Tsultrim Gyamtso. He was traveling to Lhasa when he was a young man, and in the company of the group traveling to Lhasa, which was from eastern Tibet. So from Nangchen to Lhasa, it's about, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks or maybe a month to journey by horse. But there was a man who loved to just meditate, and they camped one night, and he just said, oh, I'm just going to go off and sit quietly for myself a little bit, and I'll be back for dinner. And then he went off, and he didn't come back for dinner. And when it was late, they decided to look around and try to find him, and they couldn't find him. So then they went to sleep that night, but next morning they spent the entire day scouring the landscape to find this man, and there was no trace of him at all. So that's where then they figured that he would have been eaten by a leopard or something like that, and they just had to carry on without the man. And were very sad that they had lost this member of their crew. Anyway, they went to Lhasa, and they spent a season in Lhasa, some months, and then they came back, maybe the next spring or whatever, and they incidentally came to the same place where they had stopped, where that man had disappeared, and they were sort of just looking around, thinking perhaps they could find some bones or something from this man that they could bring back to the family. And so at that point, they happened on a cave they hadn't seen before. And in there was the man sitting meditating. And so they went in. They couldn't believe that they had found him. So they went in and very carefully approached the man, because when people have been meditating for a long time, you want to sort of nudge them very gently. So they went up to the man, very gently approached him, and he came to, and he says, oh, is it dinner time? So this is not sort of just a tall tale out of, Baron Münchhausen's or something like that, but actually something that took place that in the life of Tugurjen. There's also many stories really of like that, and we see it continually. For example, also in the life of Milarepa, then there was Milarepa himself, when he was given instructions by Marpa, he was told to sit and meditate with a butter lamp on his head. And he actually passed a week. This is just him as a beginning meditator. He passed a week just sitting with this lamp on his head without moving. And Milarepa himself had also a student who also meditating lost track of time, and the family went looking for him and so forth. So this happens. And of course, there's a lot of stories like that. I remember when I was in India, there was a sadhu. When I came to Bir in North India, and there was a sadhu who had been buried for about a month. He had been buried just nearby. There was a pipe coming down to him. He was like, I don't know, 6 feet under the ground or however long. And he had just been buried there. This was something he did. And there was some air that came down to him, but he just lay there for a month. And it was just something he did to sort of show his powers. And again, a month without, food or anything, just a little bit of oxygen coming down like that. So unusual things happen in terms of samadhi, in which there's no sense of time the way we ordinarily think of it. Okay, this was way too much entertainment. The point here, is that time is relative. So that's why, again, time as we think of it is relative. So Khenpo then goes on, absence of consensus. Now we have what's called shared perception. We might want to argue that there must be a world out there that is not mind, or there would be no consensus about the world, what the world was like. We tend to take as real whatever the general consensus of opinion dictates, especially when it coincides with our own experience and opinions. And of course, yes, we would say there is a chair, there's a floor, there's a piece of wood, and we can all agree on that. However, the thing is, if we analyze more into what is that piece of wood made up of, this is where we find out that the surface appearance of that piece of wood is not the final word on that. We go further into the matter, and we understand that it's composed of, things that don't necessarily constitute or correspond to our immediate surface perception of that piece of wood. However, yes, as Khenpo then says, consensus is only a matter of degree. We have no means of knowing whether any of us ever sees or experiences anything in exactly the same way as anybody else. At the same time, there's plenty of evidence that we do not see and experience the same thing in the same way. The difference is even more marked when one considers how different creatures experience the same thing. And then we have this classical example about the glass of water. He says, take water, for example. We experience it as something refreshing to drink. We do not normally see it as something to live in. However, fish do. A fish's view on the nature of water is totally at odds with ours. Again, take the example of someone like Mao Zedong. To some, he appeared as a dangerous enemy, and to others, a dear friend. Yet to a mosquito, he appears just like as a source of nourishment, and to the parasites in his body, a complete universe. Since for any object, its every aspect is established through the perception of the moments of consciousness perceiving it, how can its existence independent of those consciousnesses be established? Consensus does not prove anything other than certain relationships exist between different streams of experience. It does not prove that there is anything other than mind in substance. So we have that. We even have this sort of, and this also is quite, even within neuroscience, the way that we perceive phenomena is understood as something that's essentially generated as imagery within our own brain. So in that sense, there's, you could say, almost a consensus that the perceptions we have really are just a matter of shared perceptions that don't actually ultimately correspond to the perceived object. So, in fact, there are fundamental problems involved in positing the existence of some substance other than the mind. How can such substance be found or known? If something cannot be known without a knower, how can it ever be shown to exist independently? And this, of course, is a big conundrum in science also, is that we cannot exclude the observer from the entire project. This is a big issue in the 1960s. You had what was known as the science wars, because all of a sudden people like Thomas Kuhn and Michel Foucault, they came along and said, well, our understanding of science is entirely constructed by subjectivities, by cultural subjectivities. And there is no absolute object out there. There's no absolute object of knowledge. And knowledge as such is something that is constructed according to particular parameters and cultures. So all of a sudden they were saying, what are you saying that are we not doing proper science here? And it was a huge upheaval. But of course, the point is not that the validity of science was questioned, because of course science, yes, it works beautifully in terms of predicting the functioning of our shared perceptions. So that in that sense, there's not a problem. And of course, science is still receiving plenty of funding, and it's still, receiving lots of accolades and all of that. But the fundamental question, the epistemological question really was, what is it actually that we are seeing? Does it really correspond, and does it exist independently of cultures and subjectivities? And the point was that it doesn't. And that's where, of course, if we have a science that excludes the observer, then we have a science that and this is the Buddhist point, that is a rather blind and confined science that doesn't take into consideration the observer. Everything that we are labeling, the instruments that we're using, etc., the data that we're compiling, all of this is being compiled and approached in terms of culturally constructed apparate and culturally constructed conventions. So that's where everything that is known through consciousness. So how does the interface between mind and matter actually work? How can matter enter into a relationship with mind, or mind with matter? Since the alternative explanation put forward by the Chittamatrans dispenses with such problems, it demands serious considerations. Now, this is basically then the Chittamatrans are saying that the issue of something out there and a mind that's perceiving is problematic if we think that there's something out there and then there's an observer, and the solidity is at the end, the solidity and identity of the object is determined by the observer. So that's where the Chittamatrans, they question this primacy of mind. This primacy of matter. And the thing is, materialist science is entirely founded on primacy of matter, to the extent that even consciousness is understood as something that should be an emergent property of the brain and the physical. Substances that possess no consciousness whatsoever, something should miraculously occur. And this is, of course, the hard problem of science. There's nobody who can give a proper explanation from that. But the thing is, the Chittamatrans, and this we also have other places like in Vedanta and so forth, actually would identify that everything begins with consciousness. It is then with consciousness that we solidify the perceptions that we have out there. And then there's not the problems that we have in materialist science. They're not really there anymore. So that's where it's definitely, without trying to sort of create a sort of a war or conflict, just saying it's very much worth considering this primacy of matter. And this is something that is taken, there's people within the academia, the academy itself, who have put forward this proposition. We have Michel Bitbol, who's part of the Mind Life Institute, a French academic and philosopher who's put that forward. And also you have Amit Goswami, who is a nuclear physicist and who taught quantum physics at the university level in the US. And for many years, essentially subscribed to the materialist view. Being an Indian, he sort of grew up with what many Indians actually grew up with, which is sort of a huge awe of Western science, and sort of a secondary, perhaps just sort of paying lip service to his own culture, nevertheless viewed materials and Western science as being superior in terms of knowledge, until sort of in the middle of his life, he began to realize that the explanations that we had within physics, and particularly quantum physics, were not satisfactory. And he actually identified how what we have in the general modern understanding of physics is what he called upward causation. And that is where you have gross particles that then are the basis for more subtle, you could say, organisms, and eventually this then emerges as consciousness. So there's the idea then from matter, then you have biological systems, and these then produce consciousness. But there is this enormous explanatory gap that is completely not satisfactory. And this is well known within then also the community of neuroscience. So what Amit Goswami then realized was actually his own roots within Indian Vedanta propose the exact opposite. And this also is what we essentially work with in the Chittamatran understanding of relative truth, which is namely that everything originates with the mind. So that's where he talked about then downward causation, that you have then mind. And it's within mind then that there's a solidification of perceptions that then result in a shared perception of solid objects. So this works beautifully, again, because we ultimately know, and even physicists would agree with that these so-called solid objects are in fact constituted ultimately of energy. And the labeling and the solidification of that, again, we all have to admit, comes from the the one that is observing. So in that sense, the Chittamatra position is very, very valuable. Now it's important also, I would like to say, as a strong follower of the Chittamatrans. Chittamatrans, they emphasize the primacy of mind in terms of our relative truth. Chittamatrans do not necessarily say that everything is mind, even though there are some Chittamatrans that will say that. Some would say that mind has ultimate reality. That's very often what the Chittamatrans are supposed to say, but I would just like to say not all Chittamatrans necessarily subscribe to that view. There's what's called Chittamatrans subscribing to Chittamatrans subscribing to reason and Chittamatrans subscribing to scripture. So there's two different views really on the way that this is approached. Anyway, Chittamatran doctrine. In the Chittamatran school of Buddhism, elaborate explanations are given. Actually, I'll just scrap that last statement. I think actually that has more to do with Sutrantika. So just beep that last statement about scripture and reasoning out. I'll do some homework on that one. Anyway, Chittamatra doctrine. In the Chittamatra school of Buddhism, the Khenpo says, elaborate explanations are given of how the world appears as solid and real out there, when in fact, all that is occurring is transformations of a kind of mind stuff, which is like an ocean giving rise to waves. The appearance of an inner perceiving and outer perceived aspect in each moment of consciousness gives rise to the illusion that they are different substances, mind and matter. However, matter is just an imaginary concept. The solidity of some object out there is just a concept, the labeling we give to any object. Mind is empty of such a distinction between itself and what is other to it. If the meditator were to rest his or her mind in its own nature and see this emptiness, then all confusion would disappear, and the mind would be bright, clear, and self-aware. This mind is called a self-illuminating, self-aware mind. Shiba Zhangrik Zhangsel. So the cognitive quality, or the cognition that is naturally aware, simply in its own, you could say, without an object. So we could call it own awareness, sometimes called self-awareness or natural awareness, sometimes called self-awareness, but not in the sense of self-consciousness, but just an awareness that rests without object. So that condition then is what some Chittamatrans would attribute having absolute reality. It is, Khenpo says, it is called this because the mind experiences itself, Zhangi Zhang Nyongwa, meaning it is known by itself. It knows itself by itself. As we shall see, the Khenpo then says, the Madhyamikas do not accept such a mind. And in their treatises, they often refute the Chittamatrans at this point. So there's a little bit of squabbling going on, because essentially the Madhyamikas, their project is more ontological. It's more seeing what is there. And of course, that mind is not something that has any absolute reality. At the same time, the Chittamatrans, they're more what we could call, their project is more phenomenological. It's about experience. And that's where, of course, there is a cognition that's taking place. So while you could say there's a hierarchy in the sense that the Chittamatrans, they more operate at the level of experience, and the Madhyamikas, they more assert the absolute nature of this experience. In fact, they actually complement each other. So very often we have within the lineages very much a sense that the two work beautifully together, and we have many, many great masters who attain perfect enlightenment on the basis of the Chittamatra teaching. However, so the Madhyamikas, they would say, hey, this mind that you attribute absolute reality, this self-illuminating, self-aware mind, that itself also is a construction. However, the Khenpo says, the Chittamatras reply that without such a mind, there would no way that one would be able to remember past events. The perceiver and perceived aspects of each moment of consciousness that has passed have gone. If nothing had experienced it and registered an impression, how could it ever be recalled? So that, of course, we have experience there. So again, this need not really be an issue. To explain the phenomena of memory and the registering of karmic traces, the Chittamatrans posit the self-illuminating, self-aware mind. According to the Chittamatrans, a moment of consciousness does not consist of just a perceiving aspect and a perceiving aspect and a perceived aspect, meaning subject and object. There is also the self-knowing, self-illuminating aspect. It is not a separate moment of consciousness, but it is a necessary aspect of every moment of consciousness. So that's simply where there is a knower that doesn't necessarily depend on an object out there. And that's present within any given moment of experience. Is this making sense? Should we pass the psilocybin around? Yeah, this is really just coming back to the fact that we're always experiencing mind. I mean, that's what we have. If I do like this, there's a mind that knows it. Snapping finger. That's a moment of consciousness that simply just knows that something, if we were inanimate and just a bottle of water, then we wouldn't have that thought. So we have mind all the time. And that's really what the Chittamatrans are about. They're just saying there is a mind there. We can't deny that. He says, for example, when a flower is perceived, there is the perceived aspect, the flower, and the perceiving aspect that is focused on the flower. So here we have a flower, and then we have someone that knows it. The former could be called the outward-facing aspect, as opposed to the inner-facing aspect that experiences and registers both the perceiving and the perceived aspect of the consciousness as a whole. This actually we covered a lot in the Abhidharma when we talked about the object out there that is then perceived by a faculty, and then this you could say data is registered by a consciousness, and it's a consciousness that then generates the image of flower. It could be perceived vastly different by a bee or an insect or a cow, you know, yum, you know, that was yummy, right? So we have that. It is inward facing in the sense that it experiences the perceiving of the flower, registering both the flower and the consciousness, but not distinguishing these as separate entities. So there is the experience of a flower, and then there's the sense flower. And that's something that we actually just say, well, there's just flower, right? But actually what is taking place is there's an object and a subject that generates this, and we attribute solidity to that. And that's actually really what is our experience of flowers. Oh, beautiful flower, it smells so beautiful, blah, blah, all of that. That's entirely our particular consciousness that generates that reality. The outward-facing aspect is like a television camera in that it films, but does not register events. The inner-facing aspect does register and can be called a reawakened, or can be recalled or reawakened as memory. So we have the eye that sees the flower, but that's really just like an instrument. What really is sort of taking place is once it sort of comes in and it's experienced by us, then we have, oh, I saw a beautiful flower, and we can remember it, and we hold on to that as our particular perception. That's where there's this condition of consciousness that also holds this as a memory. Last week I had this and this flower standing in my dining room, and so on. Thus, the self-knowing, self-illuminating awareness is an aspect of every moment of consciousness, and is what enables the alaya vijnana to carry the traces of past events rather like a tape recorder, registering sounds. So the alaya vijnana is the very ground of our consciousness, in which all these various impressions, they're stored. Some we don't remember right now, but they're there. And we know that this is also what happens when we, for example, in dreams, all of a sudden something comes up, or all of a sudden out of the blue we remember something, and so forth. So there's all the time this condition of our history that we carry with us. So this we call the alaya vijnana. This is just a very ordinary condition that's basic to our whole experience, and it's basic to all of us on a very individual level. It's essentially what constitutes our entire samsaric existence. It's the ground of our being. It's you could say it's a sort of a pale reflection of the Dharmakaya, because it's obscured. It's very much just about me and my private experience, my memories, and so on. It's me, 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 me. It is something that lies at the very basis of who we are. And yet, it is really at that point that our ignorance, you could say, operates and veils the original condition of the mind. So we would talk about the alaya vijnana as being the storehouse consciousness in which our whole samsaric identity is contained. But it is really also that place in which we're just fundamentally ignorant. And ultimately, this alaya vijnana, as much as it is what carries all our stuff and basis for all our projections and so on, this is ultimately what we eliminate through the practice of the path. It constitutes really a cognitive obscuration. Anyway, this is what we bring with us, and that is what constructs our world. Yeah.
What's happening then with the self-knowing awareness? Like someone gets a brain injury, is it still self-knowing?
Yeah. So what happens to someone if they have a brain injury? And of course, they would be intellectually impaired and challenged and so on. That, of course, has everything to do with the brain, and that the functioning of our ordinary body as such is diminished. And so that's where there's you could say, a complete change in terms of our functioning, right? But the basic self is still there. So that doesn't change. So of course, every time, I mean, we would think of ourselves in so many different ways. Also, if we lose an arm, then also this affects us. So all these kind of different, you could say, our connection with and correlation to our physical body, whether it's the general limbs, or if it's the mental capacity and all of that, is very much tied up together. But we don't see in materialist science, we would give primacy to that. But here we would just say the material is just an expression of this all ground. So the basic conditions don't really change.
Expressions.
Well, we're just functioning differently, but the basic sense of self is still there. So the Khenpo says, thus the self-knowing, self-illuminating. Oh yeah. When the right conditions arise, they can be reactivated, as it were. And that's also if we have, for example, some impairment, then this can be trained up again on the basis of the right condition. Then, for example, we have cases in which full capacity comes back. But anything that we are anything that we experience or is basic to our sense of our particular unique experience as humans or sentient beings is essentially tied up with that particular ground from which everything arises. Like I said before, it's a bit like also in dreams. Then a particular condition comes up, or sometimes you have a smell, and then you all of a sudden remember something that happened in the past. So that's where we continually have this, the reactivation of particular conscious experiences. So the Khenpo says, when a tape is replayed, sounds are heard that correspond to the original sound that was registered on the tape. Similarly, one's karma ripens to one in a way that corresponds to the original action. Although this example is not analogous in many respects, it does illustrate the principle of the ripening or reawakening of dormant traces. So for example, if we have, it's a bit like with trauma, we talk about something comes back to us and it kicks in a particular experience. You know, somebody says something or does something, and then we sort of begin to relive something. So, see, there's a question here. Does the alaya vijnana have a continuum from lifetime to lifetime? Yes, most definitely. Is this where our karma, i.e. how the world unfolds for us based on past actions, originates? Yes. The alaya vijnana is really the foundation of samsara. It's the foundation of us. It's the foundation for our lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. This is the condition of a sentient being. And that's where what is laid down on the alaya vijnana, the way we construct ourselves, plays out in terms of our re-embodiment. So if we, for example, have been habituated in a particular way, then when this body exhausts, then our re-embodiment will be according to what's on the alaya vijnana. So that's where we would say the sentient being really carry with them in the alaya vijnana the aspects of the potential for the body, the particular realm in which they inhabit, and the conscious experience, the subjective conscious experience. So we talk about these three aspects really of body, realm, and consciousness as something that we take with us and that plays out in terms of the re-embodiment that we experience lifetime after lifetime. So we would say the initial moment of ignorance that constitutes self produces then you could say the toxic strategies and policies of the self, which is what we call the kleshas. And when we act on these, they are laid down on the alaya vijnana in forms of traces. These traces we call vasanas. And these vasanas are then the particular ways in which our experience is shaped. And this is what we call essentially the law of karma, namely how action then creates particular results. So we don't say it just happens randomly, and we also don't say it's some creator out there that is, you know, it's the will of God or whatever. So that's where we operate really with, you could say, the science of karma as the way of understanding exactly the reality that we're experiencing. If we dream, we are. If we are a dream. If we are a dream of a person perceiving a flower, does the perceiver have a real mind? Might we not be like that, and even basic awareness is an illusion? Well, that's very much the Madhyamika point, really, is that even this awareness is an illusion. So we cannot posit that as absolute. The Chittamachans are not too worried about that. They generally agree with the Madhyamikas. Chittamachans came along after the Madhyamikas, and they were really more interested in establishing a dialogue. So that's where they, you could say, operate with the formal language of something there. But of course, they agree with them, most of them agree with the Madhyamikas in that the ultimate nature of this cognitive quality is not something that has any ultimate reality and is like an illusion. Yeah. Sorry, remove the RA. If we dream of a person perceiving a flower, does the perceiver have a real mind? Well, we are perceiving something right now, doesn't it? So we do have a real mind. There is a mind that's perceiving something, and that's, you could say, the phenomenology of this perception. There's someone there. Then if we analyze it, if we look at the actual nature of this, then we cannot find anything. But as far as experience goes, there's undeniably experience happening all the time. This is the, you could say, the very stuff that we're, you could say, going through every moment, experience. What we then want to do in the Chittamachan project is to understand that all our perceptions, in fact, take place within that realm of always always bunions seems ratified to me. Bunions? Was that Bunnings? No, bunions seem B-U-N-Y-A-N-S. Bunions seem ratified to me. Why not just habits and feedback loops? Memory is so fallible. So how can we be storing and retrieving past thoughts, feelings, and perceptions as memories? Well, the fact is that this is taking place right now. So as far as our immediate, you could say, verifiable experience goes, this is right now taking place. So we can call it all sorts of things. So we can, if we wish, we can certainly call it, we can identify it and speak of it in terms of various formulas, such as, you know, loops and so forth. We can call it so many different things, but at the end of the day, we come back to this immediate experience of consciousness. So this we would say is the most, you could say, verifiable piece of empirical evidence for our, you could say, the nature of our reality. But I suspect, not being familiar with this bunions, I'm not entirely with you. Should be alaya vijnana seems autocorrect. What? Should be alaya vijnana. Okay. Yeah. Yes, autocorrect can be a bit confusing. Okay. So does a practice such as Vajrasattva purification influence the alaya vijnana? Yes. And that's where the thing is, okay, what we're talking about, whenever we talk about deity in the Vajrayana, which is just like anywhere in Buddhism, we're talking about this condition which is uncorrupted by confusion. So since it abides within the subject, you could say, we represent it in the form of deity. But it's, whether we call it the Buddha within, or we call it deity, whether we call it Vajrasattva, Samantabhadra, Buddha Shakyamuni, whatever, we're talking about this uncorrupted quality that's innate within every subjectivity. Now that remains, as you could say, something that is uncontaminated, pure. So that, in a way, is the ultimate teacher. Now, when we practice confession, and when we practice the path, we do so in conjunction with somebody who is there on the path, and with whom we then consolidate our commitment to the path. We say we take vows. We say, I take refuge, I develop bodhicitta, I commit to the particular discipline of this path. And that's why we lay down something that is, you could say, sacred to us in terms of our, you could say, promise or commitment. So that's very, very holy. Now this sometimes weakens. And that's where we do something on the Buddhist path, which is very often misunderstood. And that is the practice of confession. And the modern person can't get their head around that. Because for the modern person, there's very often a sort of a whole neurotic, problematic history about the practice of confession. So that's where there's a bit of a burden that's very culturally constructed around this issue. But it is essentially just the recognition that I have committed to a particular path, and I'm committed to that. And due to completely predictable circumstances, namely habitual patterns, I fall back. And that's where we practice Vajrasattva as a way of bringing ourselves back. We don't just say, I'm throwing in the towel, I give up on this, I'm giving up on this path. We just say, oh yeah, well, on the basis of habitual patterns, on the basis of my weakness and so on, then I fall into habitual patterns. So that's where we bring about, you could say, the vision. We recommit, reaffirm our vows. And that's where we have 4 conditions that are essentially for successfully reaffirming these vows. And that is, this is what we do with Vajrasattva. We have someone there. And that's where we could have the teacher there as someone to whom we can say, hey, I failed in my commitment. I was going to be a kind and compassionate person. I was going to sustain pure outlook. I was going to be, etc., etc. And I fell short of that. I need someone to listen to me, to hear me through. And that's where we have the support of, that's where we have the power of support. Then we have the power of regret. Unless we feel really deep regret, then it's useless. But if there's a deep regret, then it's something that we probably it will not have the same grip on us anymore. So we bring to this, you could say, the support, we also bring the regret. This is again where the modern person gets all tangled up in all sorts of very dominating discourses around the neurosis of guilt and all of that, and totally unable to understand what Buddhists are talking about. But if you're not too polluted by all that kind of, you could say, culturally constructed history, then it's something that's innately human. And it is simply just to say, oh yeah, that was not terribly smart of me. So that's where we simply just have this regret. And then we take the vow, I won't do this again. And on the basis of that vow, this commitment, this firm commitment to that, then it has already weakened within ourselves. The habitual tendency has already been firmly weakened. And then the fourth strength is then the actual practice. So this is where we then practice meditation, we practice Vajrasattva, and we also, in our ordinary life, we continue then to live what it is that we're committed to. So you can see the whole situation about us falling short of what we set out to do in terms of our vows and commitments is completely workable. It's not like, oh, I can't do this, you know, I should give up trying to be perfect, all of that kind of stuff, which is just so sort of basic to, you could say, the discourse around this in modernity. But it's something that is so powerful, and for that reason also we would say there is not a single, that negative actions, they have one quality, and that is that they can be purified. And as you can hear then, this is something that operates very much on the level of our experience. Again, phenomenology, again, something that we intuitively know what we're talking about. And this is where the scope and the place in which this takes, where this is happening is then at the level of the alaya vijnana, the very basis of our being. And that's where, on the basis of that, we feel lighter. We practice Vajrasattva, and all of a sudden our anger is gone. All of a sudden we feel lighter. All of a sudden we begin to see how our negative projections onto the world is completely unfounded. And we begin to have a trust and an appreciation for ourselves and the world around us. Things lighten up. And that's also on the basis of that, then, when we practice Vajrasattva, then this also is reflected in our perceptions, our dreams, and so on. It seems that anything we experience through the senses become, from the very beginning of our lives, become concepts. How can we then function in ordinary life without concepts? How do we become free of them? Well, we need concepts. So we're never going to become free of concepts. We need them. So concepts are very important. It's knowing that's left. Yes, that's right. And so on. But from Saul's perspective, that's not left. That's his right. And so we also understand that these concepts are relative to who we are. And that's where we also begin to see the concepts that we have, they are relatively true. My left is your right, is also something that doesn't have absolute value. And that's where we begin to have understanding of the other. That's where we begin to understand that concepts are deceptive, and yet we need them. So in relative truth, we abide by concepts. Of course, if I don't have an understanding of absolute truth, then when Saul says, hey, that's not left, man, that's right, then I understand that he's seeing things from his angle. If not, I disagree with him and said, no, mate, this is definitely left. So absolute truth is essential for us actually navigating the world with insight. Okay. So, same with the self. Yes, So we have perceptions of both phenomenal world, we have perceptions of self. They're definitely there, and yet ultimately they're not, you could say, inherently existing. Yeah.
Conceptually free.
Yeah. What we mean with conceptually free is when we're meditating, that's where we begin to let go of, this is where I begin to let go of my thoughts as being solid. So for example, I think this is left. And that's where I begin to say, okay, there's the mind labeling this left, but it's not something that I'm fixating on. And I understand that soul will see it as right. So free of concepts is when we begin to be less, you could say, fascinated by the truth of what we're seeing, what we're thinking. This is very helpful because that's also where we think he is a bad person, you know, for this reason, that person is a bad person, or I am a bad person. And we begin to realize that's actually just thoughts. So being free of concepts doesn't mean that we don't have thoughts, but it's that we begin to be less gullibly prone to believing our thoughts. Again, coming back to this sort of notion, we shouldn't believe everything we think. So free of concepts doesn't mean that we have no concepts, but that we're less prone to believing everything we think. So that's why meditation is so important, because that's where we begin to be less held by the ordinary, you could say, addiction to our beliefs. So that's why meditation hopefully leads us to be more open-minded. Okay. Well, on that note. Oh, thank you. Okay, we'll conclude here and dedicate. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Okay, today's a little bit special because it's the 10th day of the waxing moon. So this is what we normally associate in the tantric traditions. This is associated with the male principle of awakening. So this is what we call the Heruka day, the day of the Heruka. And the 10th day of the waning moon is associated with the female, and that's called the Dakini day. So in the Nyingma tradition, then the 10th day is called Guru Rinpoche day. We call it the day of Guru Rinpoche. And that's where then tantrikas, they practice feast practice. And that's where tantrikas, they actually practice confession. They practice accumulation of merit and practice also, like we were talking about before, in terms of reconfirming our vows. This is then where tantrikas, they then reconfirm their vision in terms of their commitment to their practice. So that's also what they do in conjunction with feast practice. So very kindly then, Ani Zangmo, she on every 10th day on the waxing and waning moon, she actually enables the community to join online and do feast practice. So it being such a day today, the feast practice will begin at 7 o'clock. So for those who are participating here, I don't want you to, I would be accumulating a lot of negative karma if I held some of the tantrikas back from doing their feast practice. And this is also, by the way, this is across continents, so it's also this is also practiced in Europe. I know the European Sangha is actually practicing together with the Australian Sangha. In brief, we'll just have a 2-minute break now, and then instead of doing meditation instruction, we'll just go straight to the practice, and that way we'll finish in time for people to go and do or feast practice. Tsultrim Rinpoche's guru scolds him heavily about having concepts. Indeed, yeah, he should. This was Dokens Yeshe Dorje. Yeah, he was giving Tsultrim Rinpoche a pretty hard time. That's true. Yeah. Okay, 2-minute break. So in the Samadhi Raj Sutra, it said those who while walking, sitting, standing, or sleeping recollect the moonlight Buddha will always be in the Buddha's presence and will attain the vast nirvana. And his pure body is the color of gold. Beautiful is the protector of the world. Whoever visualizes him like this practices the meditation of the bodhisattvas. In keeping with this, we should practice remembering our incomparable teacher, the Lord of Sages, in the following way. In the Buddha, the Dharma, the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, Lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks, clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders, and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our perceptions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings, ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the 3 jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha. To you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha. To you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha. To you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Yata Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Yata Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Jayata Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Jayata Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Jayata Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Jayatao Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om 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 Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations, and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. And then we go to the very last page of dedication. This is where it says concluding aspiration prayers. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world, may the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti avad yavacha jagataha stiti avan mama stiti bhuyahat Jagadukani nignata Akashasya stiti yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat Jagadukani nignata Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you very much. Sorry to have gone a little bit longer than I had anticipated. Moreover, one thing, I'm going to be doing a little bit of a retreat, and so we'll have a break with regards to the Monday programs and also the Wednesday programs until January. So the Monday program will recommence on January 17th. The 17th of January. This Sunday programs, the Treasure of Precious Qualities, I'll actually continue because I only began it recently and I just like to actually get somewhere with that. So that will actually, even though I'm in retreat, I will be doing that. So that runs on Sundays from 5:30 to 6:30. But the other programs, there'll be a break. So see you again January 17th. Thank you very much. Okay.